Hey everyone, this is Vegan Theology episode 38 with Kevin and Sarah Hale.
38. All right. And we are a year old.
Yeah.
Vegan Theology has reached our 1-year anniversary. So that's exciting.
Yeah, that's nice.
I'm very excited today to be sitting at the table, picking up the mic. We are coming to the end of this book that we have been loving going through for a while. I don't even know how long. It's been a while.
It's been a while. It's been a good book, though. It's been worth it. We're talking about Dr. Andrew Rillera's Lamb of the Free. Quite an amazing book. Not, say, a vegan book per se, but it definitely is helping to develop our vegan theology. I think with more analysis, we've read this. I'd love to read it again at some point, but I think there's a lot to digest. And I think once it's fully digested or distilled, however you want to say it, like there's a lot in there that I think could benefit a vegan theology. I think as we've mentioned, but there's more to be gleaned from it.
Always. So thank you, Dr. Rillera. And yeah, I'm so excited that we have worked all the way through it. It's been a feat. It's been a real
Well, I can't imagine writing it.
Right.
I don't know how long it took him to write.
I think he said 2 summers.
2 summers, yeah. That's hard. Still, that's hard to believe. He must have been doing nothing but reading and writing this book.
Yeah. Pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So. All right. So today we're going to cover chapter 7 and also the chapter 8, which is a conclusion chapter, wrapping it all up and giving us all the takeaways that we can go forth with.
Right.
Chapter 7 is titled, When Jesus' Death is Not a Sacrifice. All right. So if you remember, chapter 5 was, when the New Testament writers are using an analogy of sacrifice to discuss Jesus' life and death, when that does happen, the vast majority of the time, Jesus' death is associated with the non-atoning, well-being, celebratory, shared feast sacrifices that we see in the Lord's Supper, Passover, covenant inauguration, all of those happy celebratory sacrifices having nothing to do with atonement. Chapter 6 was, now we have these exceptions, these 2 exceptions, which is 1 John and Hebrews, that develop definitely a more mature, developed theology around the life and death of Jesus, which, and we'll get into this again as we go through the conclusion chapter, but which talk about how Jesus' death accomplishes what all the Levitical sacrificial system could accomplish and more and better and more permanently. And there's more to be said there, but we'll get to that. And then this chapter is all the times in the New Testament that the New Testament writers are discussing the life and death of Jesus where they do not use any sacrificial metaphor or analogy at all, even though we have read that in. And sometimes it's not even the individual reader's fault. Unfortunately, as we'll see, the New Testament translations that we all use sometimes don't do us a favor.
Right.
And they put sacrificial language in where it really isn't justified.
Right. And that also just speaks to the fact that every translation is an interpretation.
Totally. Yes. And it's not as objectively black and white as we would love to believe it is. So I love how he starts this chapter. He's basically, so when people come at me with, well, what about this New Testament text? And what about this New Testament text? Clearly, this is talking about Jesus as a sacrifice, an atoning sacrifice, or to defend a penal substitutionary atonement theology. He says the answer is always the same for any of these texts. This text is not making an analogy to any Levitical sacrifice. And he tells us right off the bat that he's not going to try to tackle every single reference to Jesus' death that he possibly could. And we're not even going to cover all the ones that he delves into in this chapter, because his writing is just so dense
Right.
and so good that we're just we're
Right.
always just doing our best to hit the highlights
Right.
and explain it in our own words as best we can
Right.
and quote him copiously.
You can always get a copy though of this book. It's amazing.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to start with the passage 1 Peter 2:24, which, by the way, is a quotation from Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage.
Yeah.
So to read that passage, he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Right away, he points out, okay, given what we've learned about the Old Testament Levitical sacrificial system, the sacrificial animal never bore the sins of anyone.
Yeah.
The sins were never put in or onto the animal. So to put this in sacrificial imagery just doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's just not logical. So what is being communicated in this passage? Basically, that Jesus' death was an act of solidarity with the sins and the curses that are resting on us, that are resting on all of humanity. So it's a passage about how he stands with us. He enters into the same condition, the same cursed condition that we find ourselves in. He becomes just like us as he takes the sin into his body. He is our example. So he responded justly to the injustices and to the sins that he was suffering. And we're to follow that example, that cruciform example. And I thought this was so fascinating. This is one of those statements that Rillera makes that just get your imagination and your mind going. He said, in suffering the injustices of others, which means when we suffer the injustices of others, we bear their sins and we bear their burdens. So to really look at the language in these passages, we are to be just like Jesus, who bore our sins in his body and who bore our burdens in his body. We are to do that. That is our example. So when we respond justly to injustices inflicted upon us, we are bearing others' sins. We are bearing their burdens.
You know, that's interesting. Presently, I've been meditating using this well-known app called Headspace. And right now he's been focusing on suffering, and he's equating suffering to compassion, which is very interesting. And I'm still trying to really understand it. But the last few meditations, he's making it sound like the more that we understand the suffering, our own suffering and other people's suffering, the more that it develops our compassion. And I mean, just what you said here just made me think of that this concept of empathy that Christ shared with us, and even God, maybe there's some sense of compassion happening here. I don't know. It's a new concept for me.
Right. And also, exactly what you're saying. I love that that's coming up even in, your Headspace app. We have the power to be like Jesus in this way that I don't know that this theology is talked about or developed very much, at least in our Protestant theology that we've grown up in, that we have this role to play in minimizing abuse and minimizing violence. When someone abuses us and we don't return it in kind, we don't retaliate, we don't punish, whatever, we actually bear it. Not only are we making it possible for there to be repair in that relationship, but we might even be having a decontaminating effect on the world. So it got me thinking, that's where my mind was going, is the whole world is now the sanctuary, and we are these co-purgation sacrifices, as Rillera says.
Right.
And when we absorb the sins of others, we are decontaminating the sanctuary that is God's world.
Yeah, it's also interesting too, right? Because we use this concept of absorbing suffering, absorbing pain. Like Christ came in and absorbed the world's sin and suffering and pain. And I feel like the first time I ever heard of a concept like that was not from church, but from the civil rights movement. You know, John Lewis and a lot of these civil rights guys. I mean, when they would go out and do these marches and then they would get beaten by police or other white people, they talked about not retaliating and not really even saying anything, but just continuing on with a mission and absorbing the pain. And they'd have bruises, broken bones, blood. And yet there was this concept of absorbing it. And I just wonder if that's obviously Christ gave us that example. And we know that many of the civil rights people were Christians and they got recharged by going to church. And, you know, the church played a huge part in the civil rights movement in the United States. And I'm sure other places as well. I'm just aware of the United States. But yeah, it's interesting. It makes me wonder how much further ahead were they, the black church, than the white church in this concept, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I think Flannery O'Connor has at least one story that talks about this very concept.
Which one is that?
Well, it's a controversial title.
Oh.
So I'm a little nervous about
Okay.
It's a little, tinderbox.
Yeah, there we go.
But yeah, I love Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Definitely worth more thought and more development on that whole idea. The second passage or set of passages that Rillera addresses are Mark 10 and Matthew 20. So the same passage or the same phrase shows up in both of those Gospels. And they read, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And again, a lot of us and the New Testament translators see that word ransom and think sacrifice.
Right.
But Rillera points out this Greek word, the original language uses the word litron, which is that word is never associated with the Old Testament Levitical sacrificial system. That word means liberation. It's the price paid for someone's liberation, for their ransom from captivity. Jesus is the liberator. So who do the gospel writers, Matthew and Mark, say Jesus is liberating us from? Who's being liberated and from whom? Let's read what Rillera says. Hence, a key question is, to whom are the many enslaved? What are the many being delivered from? The parable of the strong man in Mark and Matthew and Jesus' many exorcisms give the answer. Jesus has come to liberate the people from Satan and his demons and all the impurities or impure spirits and ailments he has afflicted them with.
And further, this is liberation from the devil, the strong man, because it is the devil who has used death to enslave Israel and the world in cursed and sinful societal habits and practices, depriving them of the flourishing God desires. And that's from Hebrew 2:14 and 15.
Yeah.
So that's interesting, right?
I love this. And this comes out more and more as we go through these passages. Like, God is the rescuer. Satan is the enslaver.
Right.
And Jesus has come. God has sent Jesus to liberate us. With all of these passages, what I love is that God is not mad at us. God is not, oh, I have to punish you.
Right.
God is not, oh, you disgusting, vile waste. No, the disgusting, vile waste is the curse.
Right.
It's what's causing all of us to suffer.
Right.
All of our ailments and all our infirmities and all our suffering. That's what God came to deliver us from. It's such a beautiful, encouraging message.
Right. And I feel like this book has really been very encouraging in that sense. And I remember there was a professor at Moody Bible that would say, you can't take an oil bath without getting some of it on you. And I feel the same is true of living in this world. You can't live in this world that's broken and been affected by the fall and expect to come out unscathed or unscarred. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. Even if you're trying to live your best life, we're living in a broken world. So,
right. According to these passages, God clearly sees that and wants to save us from it.
yeah.
The next one we'll look at is Galatians 3:13. The passage is, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on the tree, in order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promise of the Spirit through faith. So this reading, the phrase, Christ redeemed the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Some people see that, again, as some kind of sacrificial animal, which is a complete misunderstanding of what was going on in Old Testament sacrifice. I love what Rillera says in this section. It needs to be pointed out that all Paul seems to be getting at with his use of curse language is that Jesus shared in the same condition plaguing those now under the curse of the law. This is the language of solidarity, not substitution.
Yeah.
It's important that we see that difference. It's not just an image of Christ becoming some sacrificial animal that's somehow bearing our sin. No, it's Christ in solidarity entering into our situation to save us from it.
Yeah. Rillera explains Paul further by saying, thus Paul is at pains to communicate the simple point, not that sin or curse was transmitted from others to Jesus at the cross, but that God's own Son participated fully in Israel's cursed condition his entire life.
I like that phrase, his entire life. If you remember back to our previous conversation, the work that Jesus did wasn't just isolated to what he did on the cross.
Right.
It was Jesus' entire, fully obedient life of his contagious holiness and his healing. All of it was Jesus participating fully in Israel's cursed condition,
Right.
his entire life. So that's what that passage is really saying. And the next one we'll look at is Romans 8:3. The passage is, for God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and to deal with sin, he condemned sin in the flesh.
Yeah, and here we're just, as we read these passages, I think we're just getting some consistency that this framework is the real deal. Rillera says about Romans 8:3, Paul says that it is sin being condemned, not atoned for. In this way, Paul is saying that despite what a Roman judicial crucifixion might imply, it was sin, not Jesus, that was condemned as criminal. If it is sin that is condemned, then it is not Jesus, not human beings, and therefore not Jesus instead of human beings. The only thing being condemned is sin.
Yeah, that's really key.
Yeah.
It's really key. It's not humans who are being condemned or who were condemned. It's just sin.
Right. And I also feel like it's consistent with the overall message of the Bible, right? We lived in a paradise. The fall happened. It affected everything. And now we could point fingers at who's responsible. And as we'll find out, we're going to continue reading some of the understandings of the way Roman emperors dealt with conquered peoples and them having, I don't want to say compassion and or empathy on them. But yeah, I think just what you're saying, the issue here is not human beings, the co-creators with God, but it's the condition, it's the sin, the state
and
that we're in.
Whatever culpability we may carry, the point is God is saying, I am going to rescue you. I am going to do whatever it takes to get back in relationship with you. I love you. I have mercy on you.
Right.
It's not that God is coming at us with condemnation.
Right.
God is coming at us with loving, benevolent rescue.
Well, also, God created us for a relationship. Yeah. He didn't create us to kill us.
Yeah. Yeah, he finishes this section. The remedy for sin in Romans is deliverance and rescue. So again, it just makes me happy. It just lifts my heart. It's very comforting. And it kind of goes back to what we've said in a previous episode. If people were given this gospel, nobody would reject this gospel.
Right.
It's nothing but good news.
Right.
Okay. The last passage we're going to look at is very interesting. Romans 25 and 26. This is just a phrase that, well, let's just say there's been some problems translating. The phrase is that Jesus is and the Greek word is hilasterion. Hilasterion. And there's been some debate on what that is and how to translate that. And of course, depending on how it's been translated, it has theological ramifications.
Right.
And I looked this verse up in the NIV as we were preparing for this. And there in the footnotes, it said, hilasterion is the word for the Ark of the Covenant lid, the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. And so it's hearkening back to that Jesus is for us what all the Levitical sacrificial system accomplished.
Right.
But I think Rillera makes an amazing case that is not the true, best, faithful translation. One thing that's very convincing about that is in the Greco-Roman world, that word hilasterion had a very well-known, powerful meaning. It was a conciliatory gift that was offered and given between two warring parties. If there were just two nations or two city-states or two groups of people who were at war, there's all these legends that he quotes and he references in the Greco-Roman world where one of the parties would offer a conciliatory gift to the other.
Right.
As a way of saying, hey, we respect you, we want to reconcile with you, we want peace with you. And so every time you look at this conciliatory gift, lots of times they were statues that were placed like within the temples of the other party. Every time you look upon this conciliatory gift from us, remember that we want peace with you.
Right.
And again, think about who was Romans written to. It wasn't written to people who are really familiar with the Levitical sacrificial system. It
Right.
wasn't written to the Jews. It was written to the Gentiles.
Right. And he pulls out a statement here. I can just read this. But like you mentioned, there were some warring parties. Julius Caesar set up the Pax Romana, and it happened roughly it was like a 200-year period. It was basically 31 BCE to about 180 CE or AD as we call it. So for 200 years. So if you just think about this, it started before Jesus was born, about 30 years before Jesus was born. It was going on during Jesus' life on earth and the disciples' life on earth and the writers of the New Testament. So this Pax Romana was happening during the writing of the New Testament. So they would have been very familiar with this idea, right?
Yeah.
So here's just a summary here, right? Briefly summarized, after Julius Caesar's death, the empire fell into a brutal civil war between Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir Octavian and Mark Antony. Metropolis was loyal to Mark Antony, but Octavian ended up winning the war. Instead of punishing the cities loyal to Mark Antony, Octavian went on a grand clemency and reconciliation mission and initiated the Pax Romana. He permitted citizens, especially those in regions once loyal to Mark Antony, to erect votive gifts, conciliatory gifts that celebrated his divine virtues. And these particular votive gifts were set up between 3127 BCE as gestures of reconciliation from the citizens of Metropolis. They were set up in celebration of Octavian's clemency and to demonstrate Metropolis's allegiance to Octavian since they previously were loyal to Antony. So,
I mean, that's such a compelling, culturally relevant argument
right.
that all of these readers of the book of Romans would know and fully understand. I mean, this would be the stuff of legends, that they would all know the story of how conciliatory gifts are given to make peace. And he cites how, Homer wrote about this and Virgil wrote about this. This was a well-known story. And if you think about, okay, what is Paul then saying? He's taking this well-known cultural, mythology, and he's applying it to Jesus, that Jesus is God's conciliatory gift to us.
Right.
So there was enmity going on, and God says, here's a conciliatory gift to show you how much I love you, to show you how much I want to have peace with you. It's a beautiful image. It's a powerful image that Jesus is God's merciful goodwill and peacemaking gift. I love what Rillera says. The cross is not the precondition for God's forgiveness. So if you think about that in this context, rather, the cross is what proves how unrelenting God's love is, even for God's enemies.
Yeah.
So when people look at the cross, when people look at Jesus, like a consolatory gift, they see, oh, I'm reminded that God is reaching out to me. God is saying, I want peace with you.
Right.
To read further, humanity is being saved not from God, but from sin and death. Paul thinks the cross is what God endures in Jesus as God forgives, overlooks, and does not account people's sins. The death of Jesus is what God undergoes as he loves his enemies so as to be reconciled to them, which requires God to enter enemy territory, so to speak. So this is how Rillera translates this passage. He's saying, Paul is essentially saying, look at Jesus. God is not your enemy. You are the ones at enmity with God. God is justifying you even though you are ungodly. God has put forth Jesus as a conciliatory votive gift of peace and reconciliation to demonstrate this. Be reconciled to God. God loves you. If God did not spare God's own Son, then nothing can separate you from the love of God revealed and manifested in Jesus Christ. Jesus eternally stands in the presence of God, like votive gifts stand in temples, interceding for us all.
Right. And it's also worth noting, I just want to point this out, he goes to some length to discuss how hilasterion has nothing to do with animals and or an animal sacrifice. And just a quote here, he's speaking about another theologian. He says, and as Bailey determines, since we do not have a single example of a hilasterion that is a sacrificial animal in Jewish or pagan literature or inscriptions, we shall have to abandon the idea that a hilasterion is a victim. So just to make the point further, right? This isn't about atonement. This isn't about someone taking our place, substitution. This isn't about animal sacrifice. This is about everything we just mentioned, a reconciliation gift.
I know. I mean, thank God there are people who are able to know the original languages.
Right.
And who devote their life to studying the Bible in the original languages. Because how would we ever know any of this as people living in 2024 or whatever? We would never understand the richness of what Paul is saying there.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to the conclusion of chapter 7. Rillera says, it is now apparent how relatively rare sacrificial imagery is within New Testament texts that address the meaning and function of Jesus' death. And many texts that modern readers often interpret to speak of sacrifice turn out, under examination, not to do so. None of the texts examined above, for instance, are making an analogy to any Levitical sacrifice.
Wow.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And now we find ourselves at the conclusion, chapter 8.
Wow.
So I would say the structure of this conclusion chapter is he begins by saying, okay, let's review some of the ground we've covered. And then he goes into two big problems with this view of penal substitutionary atonement, how it is not adequate to describe the life and death and resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start with his review of the book, or the takeaways so far. So the first one is he reminds us that neither death nor suffering nor punishment of the animal has any place in the sacrificial system. Therefore, any view of justice that is rooted in the mistaken view that biblical sacrifice is about punishment or substitutionary death must be utterly rejected by Christians.
Wow.
So that's a very strong statement
Yeah.
that he doesn't necessarily fully impact the social implications of, but it doesn't take a lot to start to see what he's talking about,
Right.
or to make the connection in our minds that if we see that godly justice or biblical justice has to do with punishment and suffering of the offender or the death of the offender, if that's what we think God's idea of justice is, which, I mean, let's be honest, that is kind of what we've been taught to some degree.
Right.
That's a mistaken view biblically, that God's justice has nothing to do with punishment or substitutionary death or the suffering of the person. Okay.
All right, a second point here. There are atoning sacrifices and there are non-atoning sacrifices in the Old Testament. How do we know which is which? If the offer eats the sacrifice, it is a non-atoning, celebratory feast with God to commemorate some act of divine deliverance.
Yes, that's definitely a big paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Okay, number 3, sacrificial kippur or sacrificial decontamination. It's very limited in its effectiveness. Very limited. The only things that kippur purifies are the sanctuary and the sancta from ritual impurities, which, remember, have nothing to do with sin, and from some sins. But again, the only thing being decontaminated is the sanctuary.
Right.
That's it. That's all the sacrifice
Right.
was ever promised.
Not the person.
Yes. So all the grave sins, which remember are idolatries and murder and sexual immorality, those grave sins contaminate the sinner as well as the land. And atoning sacrifices could not handle that.
Right. His fourth point, the sacrifice the New Testament authors mostly write about in reference to Jesus is the non-atoning well-being sacrifices, primarily the Passover and the covenant-making sacrifices, the Lord's Supper.
Right. 5, Jesus is a contagious source of holiness that purges all manner of impurities on contact. Therefore, his contact with death and subsequent resurrection encapsulates the salvation of the world, brought through the curse of death and into indestructible life.
Yeah, I still remember that chapter. That was some good stuff. It really was. Yeah, I mean, I can go further, but I mean, that was just, I was going to say, if people want to read, get some good reading in, I would get this book and, work your way through it. It's a labor of love in some ways. It's jam-packed, but when you get to chapter 5, chapter 6, it's mind-blowing for sure. And the 6th point. 1 John and Hebrews show how Jesus accomplishes what all the different Old Testament sacrifices and cultic liquids did and more, and permanently. Hebrews also shows how believers are made into co-purgation sacrifices with him as they bear his reproach in cruciform suffering. And we are decontaminating the sanctuary that is the whole world.
Yeah. Now, Rillera doesn't really, I don't think, unless I missed it, maybe he planted the idea in my head and I'm like, oh no, I think this is my original idea. But that's what comes up for me for sure. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but yeah, this idea that we have the power as co-creators to not return evil for evil, but to actually, as co-purgation sacrifices in this sanctuary, is how I'm seeing it, of this creation of God's world, that we are acting just like Jesus when we suffer injustices in a just manner.
Well, I mean, it's everything we've talked about in this podcast, right? God created a peaceful, nonviolent world, and he made us image bearers, which were really co-creators, viceroys, to continue his creation, to expand it across the whole world. The entire earth was supposed to be a temple,
Yeah.
right? And that's what it's going to be in the eternal state as we're reading it. And so, just what you said. Also, when we talked about how this overlapping ages, right? We have this, we talked about the already not yet, that Christ has done this. It's already started. And here we are still living in the sinful world, but it's our job to start pushing back against sin and evil and start creating again, right? Creating good, moving us toward the new creation. And so, just what you're saying, we're living in this world, injustice happens to us, turn the other cheek, right? When we turn the other cheek, as I'm understanding what you're saying, is that we are creating peace. We are creating nonviolence. We are not responding in kind, but we are doing the opposite. And in some ways, we're trying to build reconciliation in that moment.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating. And that's us creating.
Yeah. Yeah. It's huge. And then Rillera says, okay, given everything we've learned, now let's look specifically at how the notion of substitution, when it's applied to the saving uniqueness of Jesus, is a problem. It's inadequate. Rillera writes, I reject the concept of substitution because it obscures how Jesus' death is not only ethically paradigmatic. In other words, this is where we get our paradigm for how we should ethically live.
Right.
By looking at Jesus' death, but also, according to the New Testament, the reality that those united with Jesus literally participate and share in experientially by the Spirit. The concept of substitution grates against the call to participate in the cross, since by definition, it conceptualizes Jesus' death as something he endured so that others can avoid it. Penal substitutionary atonement names the cross as what those who benefit from Jesus' death necessarily get to escape, since it is construed as in our place and instead of us. It thereby opens the door to the satanic idea that one can be a disciple of Jesus and avoid the cross. The consistent message throughout the entire New Testament is not that Jesus died instead of us. Rather, it repeatedly indicates that Jesus dies ahead of us so that we can unite with him and be conformed to the image of his death.
Right. Continuing on, however, Jesus' death is soteriologically unique. And part of its uniqueness is because Jesus is our pioneer and forerunner, setting the pattern and paradigm for what covenant faithfulness of loving God and loving neighbor means. Jesus' death is unique, especially since it generates the singular reality that grounds Christian ethics that all can share in, or rather, will share in. And he references Colossians 1:27 and 3:10 and 11. We are baptized with his same baptism of the cross. We drink from his same cup of the cross, Mark 10:38-45. The point is union with Christ, participation and solidarity, not separation and distance or substitution.
So this definitely colors what it means to be a Christian very differently than what we've previously understood, maybe.
Well, and I love the beginning of what you read because I feel like that is what so much of, I'm just going to say evangelical, maybe it's American evangelical theology, talks about escape. Escape, escape, escape. We're all going to heaven. We're going to get out of this ugly mess called earth. And so we have Christians living among us today who don't care about what happens to earth. They don't care about what happens to animals because it's not their problem. Mm-hmm. God's going to clean it up. This is like a Superfund site that God's going to clean up, and they get to escape. Yeah. And so much of that theology, so much of that mindset is escape.
Right. And the belief that we get to escape even suffering. That somehow being a Christ follower means that we're going to have a really blissful, blessed, perfect, pain-free life.
Right.
And that is not at all what the New Testament is saying.
No. Even this idea that we started with and what I said I got from Headspace, that suffering leads to compassion.
Right.
And so many of the church fathers and the mystics have talked about suffering.
Yeah, it's like Jesus is saying the way to fix this world is to enter into the brokenness and experience the brokenness, even though that is so painful, and to respond with justice and mercy.
Right.
Rillera says, I want to emphasize that I uphold the uniqueness of Jesus' saving act, but I think substitution is a wrong-headed and misleading term to conceptualize that uniqueness. Let's use another analogy based on a true story. If my kids are trapped to their knees in quicksand and I get in there and I get muddy to rescue them, how do you conceptualize what I just did? What do you call me? I know one thing you wouldn't call me: a substitute. Replace quicksand with curse or sin and death, and me with Jesus. And this is Paul's narrative of divine deliverance. Substitution does not accurately conceptualize what is happening. Solidarity is more on target.
Right. So here's just another example. Since we don't conceptualize many people who perform analogous acts of deliverance, rescue, or healing as substitutes, example surgeons, quicksand rescuers, etc., then there is no need to do that for Jesus apart from an a priori and problematic assumption about what salvation must entail. All I know is that whatever Jesus did, the overwhelming apostolic witness is that we are called to share and participate in it. Substitute is a theologically impoverished way at trying to sum that up. Jesus is our deliverer and healer. He is not our substitute.
Yeah, it's helpful. It's helpful. I knew this was going to happen. I knew that a lot of the theology that has been hardwired or whatever into my brain, it's starting to be taken down.
Yeah.
Because this is so much more resonant. And yeah, I appreciate how we have spent time, how Rillera has helped us spend time kind of steeping in this new way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Because it does take time and reiterations to start to identify what has been false in my theology and what is the new, more resonant theology. All right. The second big problem that Rillera says that we have when we adhere to a penal substitutionary atonement is really fascinating.
Yeah.
The next subheading is substitutionary resurrection ?
Right.
So this is big. Basically, he points out, and I think, Kevin, you were going to read some of these passages, that Paul's consistent logic throughout the epistles is that as goes our relation to Jesus' death, so goes our relation to his resurrection. Okay, I'm just going to read that again. According to Paul, the logic is, as goes our relation to Jesus' death, so goes our relation to his resurrection.
Right.
So the point, should I give it away before you read these?
Yeah. So that way, do it that way when we read it, it's going to make more,
right.
It's going to click.
The point is, if Jesus' death is substitutionary, like instead of us, then so is his resurrection instead of us. But if his resurrection isn't substitutionary, then neither is his death. So by definition, if we try to hold to a penal substitutionary atonement, this would indicate that no one else will ever be raised, since Jesus was our substitutionary resurrection.
Right.
He is resurrected so that no one else has to be.
Right.
This, of course, is unthinkable.
Right. And so here's some passages that bring this up, that bring up the logic of Paul, where he's basically putting death and resurrection together. So first one, and I'm reading from the ESV, just for grins, Romans 6:5. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we shall certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. Okay. Next, Philippians 3:10 and 11, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may attain the resurrection from the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 2 Corinthians 4:10, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. Ooh.
Yeah.
Oh, that seems pretty clear. Right there.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I mean, yeah, if we want to participate in the resurrection, we have to be willing and prepared to participate in the crucifixion
Right.
in our own bodies. They go hand in hand. I think it's convincing.
Oh,
it's convincing.
Yeah, it's such a strong point.
Jesus did not die instead of us. He died ahead of us. He showed us. This is what life in this world has to look like.
Yeah.
But we will be risen into indestructible life.
And so if you're not suffering,
we're all suffering, right? Life is hard.
Yeah, it is.
Life is hard.
I'm teasing.
Yeah. And sometimes all you can do is laugh about it.
Right.
All right. Okay. This brings us to the end of the book. But I felt like
Wow.
I just wanted, if it's okay, I just wanted to read the last few paragraphs of the book because I just wanted him to be able to end the book in his own words.
Right. Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, it's been a great book, and we appreciate him a lot. So
maybe I'll start, and then you can pick up with therefore understanding.
Yep.
Okay. So this is some of how he finishes this great book. I titled this book, The Lamb of the Free, as a play on words with the national anthem of the United States, because I want to highlight how the salvation and freedom Jesus gives to the world upends the worldly notions of freedom and justice as represented in the U.S. national anthem. Those who share in Jesus' death are free from the reign of sin and death in their mortal bodies. They are free to enact a merciful justice, the very justice that was revealed in Jesus Christ. They are free to enter the heavenly holy of holies as co-high priests. They are free to be co-purgation sacrifices with Jesus and co-well-being sacrifices. They're free to have fellowship in Jesus' sufferings and death so that we might share in his resurrection. And we are free to continually offer sacrifices of thanksgiving. And I should mention, every single one of those statements he backs up with all kinds of references throughout the New Testament, which I kind of glossed over.
Yeah.
But
yeah, it's jam-packed. So
yeah.
So he's backing up his points very well. All right, therefore, understanding the concepts of sacrifice and kippur properly is part of understanding the story of salvation the New Testament is telling. For instance, if we think sacrifice is all about punishment and retributive justice, then we will fundamentally misconstrue the sacrificial images applied to Jesus. This means we will misconstrue what salvation and justice mean, because these terms will be informed and defined by alternative stories and frameworks. But getting the concepts and story right are crucial, not only for an individual Christian's formation, but also our collective formation as part of a common and shared tapestry, faithfully witnessing to the salvation of God in Jesus Christ as his body, the church.
Understanding the New Testament's sacrificial imagery ought to reframe our imaginations. For example, when we think about the story of Passover and the covenant inaugurated on Sinai, the story of the Exodus, we realize that eating from the table of the Lord as the ultimate Passover lamb and mediator of the new covenant fundamentally reframes our relationship to all the nations, let alone our home nation. These are the Egypts from which we are being liberated. We who are being ruled over by what Paul calls the powers, the pharaohs, sin and death, and what Peter calls your empty way of life handed down from your ancestors. Jesus is the Lamb of the free because he sets us free from the reign of these pharaohs and their futile, disorderly forms of life, which manifest in the various idols all peoples have worshipped since the beginning. And the church has been lured into as well wealth, security, pleasure, punishment, strength, etc. We are being liberated to be a corporate well-being sacrifice for the life and healing of all the nations of the world. We are announcing to the world the conquest of the pharaohs, sin and death, which enslave and trap the nations in all manner of systems of oppression and domination. Sounds pretty vegan.
Yeah, it does. I know.
I had to say that.
Yeah.
Systems of oppression and domination. Yeah, we are trying to stand against those.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The final paragraph. So when we get the sacrificial concepts right by understanding the larger story of which they are a part, then we can find our place within that story, and as Paul says, become sharers and partakers of the body and blood of Jesus. And by so doing, we become a living well-being sacrifice ourselves, narrating the death of Jesus in our bodies for the life and reconciliation of the world.
That is beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. And by so doing, we become a living well-being sacrifice ourselves, narrating the death of Jesus in our bodies for the life and reconciliation of the world. Wow. It's a powerful ending.
Yeah.
What an amazing book.
It is an amazing book.
I feel like we're just repeating ourselves, but it really has been life-changing.
Yeah, it's been eye-opening. Thank you, Dr. Rillera, for the amazing work. And I know he's got more work coming that are going to be just as impressive. So definitely going to be keeping our eyes on him.
So thank you, everyone, for being here with us. We appreciate you. You mean the world to us. And I hope you have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Later.